Today we're going to talk about the historical Buddha, why it's important to have a historical Buddha, if it's important. I'm going to raise some problems and try to give at the end a solution, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're interested in courses about early Buddhism and related topics, check out onlinedharma.org, and we'll get around a little bit more to that at the end of this video. So the historical Buddha, or we might say the Buddha of history. Now there's a lot of questions around whether it's important and to what extent it's important that the Buddha might really have existed. Now Buddhism isn't like Christianity in the sense that whereas in Christianity it's really necessary that Jesus existed and that the actual things happened to him as occurred in the Bible, or at least as discussed in the Bible, in order for Christian faith to be reasonable. On the other hand, in Buddhism it's not quite the same. So long as the path is effective, it doesn't really matter to many of us whether the Buddha actually existed, whether he was an actual historical figure. Nevertheless, the question as to the historicity of the Buddha, the question that might arise around, let's say, whether the Buddha was real, isn't just a question, a sort of a Western conceit kind of thing. It isn't just a question that arose in the modern context, and I'm going to try to argue some of the background to that coming up. But you at least need the path to be effective to some degree in order to have confidence in the path. You need to have some confidence in the effectiveness and the success of the path and the success of the practice. And one of the ways that we gain confidence or knowledge about the effectiveness of these practices is to see how they've worked for other people before. And of course, one of the people that they seem to have worked for was the Buddha himself. Gautama being somebody who began as somebody who was not awakened and became awakened and seems to have changed through that time. And of course other people as well after his time who've also claimed to become awakened, or at least to have gained some kind of advantages along the path, who seem to have become better, their lives have become easier, things have changed for them. So one way that we can gain confidence in this path is by looking at history, by looking at the stories of real people, either historically or contemporaneously. However, it's also true, and I think we have to keep this in mind, that a lot of people gain confidence in a path or in certain features of their lives through stories that are not historical, through legends, through myths. Indeed, this is part of the way that religions have worked throughout history, is by providing stories around which we model our own lives. Whether that be, let's say, the story of Jesus, of his virgin birth, of the legends around his birth and his youth, whether it has to be the legends surrounding his death and supposed resurrection. These are things that many of us, many Christians of course, will model their own lives after in certain respects. And of course the ancients also, the Greeks and Romans, modeled their lives in certain respects around the Greek and Roman deities. They saw them as exemplars around whom they could model themselves as successful people. And also within Buddhism, we have legendary stories, say around the Buddha's, the 4 sights that the Buddha had, that revealed to him the nature of the world, that the world is full of pain, of suffering, of illness, of old age. And these are stories that many of us, again, find compelling, even though to some degree or another, they are pretty clearly legends, they're pretty clearly mythic in certain respects. Now, why do I say that these stories are mythic or legendary in certain respects? And it's pretty clear that they are, because they involve certain kinds of inconsistencies, either interior with the way that they tell the story, or inconsistencies with the way that we believe the world to be. They may involve miracles of various kinds, that is, the breaking of our ordinary conceptions of cause and effect. And in stories of that kind make it difficult for us to accept them at least as historical, at least for some of us. Now, we may say that this concern with historicity, as it's called, with coming up with consistent stories like this, is some kind of a modern conceit, or even a modern Western conceit, that that somehow people in the past didn't have the same interest in historical accuracy. But I don't think this is the case. And one way we can look at this is by looking at, indeed, the way the ancients looked at the world. Not all of them, but some exceptional ones. One example being Socrates. Socrates is one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. He's sort of one of the founders of ancient Greek philosophical thinking. He was Plato's teacher, and Plato then eventually taught Aristotle, so he's really, in many ways, the father of Western philosophy. And Socrates, in a dialogue called the EUTHYPHRO, which is a dialogue written by Plato, Plato, you may know, wrote about Socrates, and Socrates never wrote anything himself, and so Plato was sort of his, if you like, his mouthpiece. Plato was the person who put him into writing. So in the EUTHYPHRO, Socrates is having a discussion. And the discussion revolves around the fact that Socrates, has been accused of impiety by the Greeks. Some of us also will know that Socrates was involved in a very great controversy. He was actually taken to court in ancient Greece by the people of Athens, and was condemned to death, and was convicted, indeed, of impiety, and was eventually forced to commit suicide because of this. And he did this apparently willingly because he did not feel that he had done anything wrong. But in any event, in this dialogue, he's discussing this charge of impiety. And Socrates says that he is charged with making up his own gods and with denying the gods of ancient Greece. And that is, of course, what the charge of impiety is about. What Socrates says is, I have no particular liking for anything but the truth. In other words, it's not that he likes one opinion or another. What he likes is the truth. And this leads him to the opinion in this dialogue, he discusses this opinion that the Greek gods are not actually quarrelsome, that the Greek gods don't actually quarrel with one another, that they're not actually vain and quarrelsome and difficult and constantly fighting. Because he says, if that were the case, then what would be pious for one god might be impious for another. And that simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that you could be sort of pious, pious in the wrong way for one god. In other words, pious for one god, but that another god would consider impious. That doesn't make sense. That notion of piety doesn't seem to compute for him, or at least within the context of ancient Greek understandings of piety. Indeed, this leads him to the view that what is good or bad is independent of the opinions of the gods. Piety, indeed, is the attitude we should have for someone who is always good, who is always upholding the right, who is always upholding ethics, who's always, we might say, behaving skillfully. And the only way for us, or the only reason for us to be pious towards the gods, is if they themselves are upholding this kind of purity. And for that to be the case, this purity must be independent of the gods' own opinions, because otherwise they could fight over them. In other words, if piety or if goodness only had to do with the opinions of the gods, then one god might have one opinion, another god might have another opinion, and that would put us in a situation where we literally could never be pious in the correct way. We could never follow correct ethics, because ethics would be contradictory. It would depend which god you were after. So what Socrates is arguing is that the traditional histories of the gods within ancient Greece, these historical stories of the gods, are incorrect. They're not historical. What's true is something else. The truth is different from the supposed histories. All of these supposed histories of the gods quarreling over things and being vain and doing bad things, these are just legends, and we should really dispense with the legends. Or at least we should dispense with the legends insofar as we wanted to understand the truth, which is really what drove Socrates. Now, the Buddha himself had similar kinds of opinions. In several texts, the Buddha says things about the gods of ancient India which resonate with the kinds of views that Socrates had. The Buddha in particular argues against the position that the gods are omniscient or that they are immortal. The picture of the gods we get in the Buddha's view are beings who are, of course, extremely powerful, but who are not immortal. They eventually will die, and who are in fact quite ignorant about things. That they are vain and ignorant. And indeed, I did an earlier video about this. I'll put a link up here on the screen. You can see it if you're interested, about where he says these things and what he says. So basically, the Buddha is arguing that in various respects, the traditional history of the gods, the traditional understanding of the gods, as being these omniscient beings who are not only omniscient but who never die, who are immortal. He's saying these traditional histories don't compute. They don't hang with the way we understand the world to be, which is a world in which all things are always changing, and a world in which is based around ignorance, basically. And so, as a result, the Buddha rejects the traditional histories of the gods. Now, some of us will say that in both of these situations, both the Buddha and Socrates accepted the existence of gods, and so to that extent, they may be at least out of touch with some modern views, some atheistic views, let's say, or secular views about the world. But that's not really the point. That's not the point I'm trying to get at. The point that I'm trying to get at here is that in both the cases of the Buddha and Socrates, they understood a difference. They saw a difference between traditional legendary histories and something more accurate, that was more in conformity with the truth, the way things really were. So that this distinction between history and legend is not something, let's say, modern or Western conceit that's sort of come up recently. It's something that's always been with us. So the question that we began with was the question about whether there's a difference between the Buddha of history and the Buddha of legend, and whether that difference makes a difference to us. That is to say, is there such a thing as a historical Buddha? A historical Buddha is sort of the way it's understood. That's the sort of phrase that we use, the way we might talk about a historical Jesus. Within the history of early Christianity, there are people talking about the historical Jesus, a way of uncovering what Jesus might actually have been like as a person, as opposed to, let's say, the Jesus of faith, which is quite a different kind of character, who is more in line with, let's say, the legends. And if we look at the early Buddhist texts, a group of texts from the Pali Canon and other related material, what we find there is a Buddha, a figure, a character who is really quite different from the Buddha that we would find in legend. We find a more historically compelling Buddha. That is to say, we find histories, we find stories that don't conflict with our understanding of the way the world works. We don't find stories that are all built around, let's say, legend and myth, that are all built around various kinds of miracles. Now, this is not to say that there are not miraculous occurrences within the early Buddhist texts. Indeed, there are many of them. That may be for various reasons. The first reason, we might say, is that, of course, not all of these early Buddhist texts are quite as early as others. Some of them may stem from the period after the Buddha's life. They may have been constructed as hagiographic stories, making the Buddha out to be a little bit more than he might have actually been. Other stories may have been told indeed during the Buddha's lifetime, and indeed even in the Buddha's presence, and may have been told for other reasons than, let's say, historical accuracy. Because while I think we've established that the ancients, just as well as we, understood the difference between legend and history, nevertheless, I think in every culture it's understood that sometimes a story may be told for another reason than historical accuracy. It can be told simply, as we've discussed before, to inspire, to provide a framework for our lives, to make us think of greater things. And so we can't assume that in every case the absolute necessity was to be historically accurate. That kind of nitpicking accuracy about every last case that goes into every story, that's something that's really only of interest to a very small number of people. Most people do enjoy some legend in their lives. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, let's say, books such as Tolkien's Middle-earth, other kinds of legends that we see now in the movies and in television and on books. These are very popular. They're popular for a reason, because we do find a lot of truth in them. Even if they're not even claiming to be historically accurate, they provide truth around which we can construct a life. So while these early Buddhist texts contain a lot of different kinds of material, that's not really the point. The point is, among that material, or within that material, we find a very historically compelling kind of story of a real person, of a person meeting struggles, meeting difficulties, overcoming these difficulties in various ways, but in ways that are not obviously hagiographic, in the ways that are not obviously constructed out of whole cloth by later people trying to make somebody look perfect. Because there are many respects in which the Buddha of the early Buddhist texts does not look perfect. He suffers pains. He has back pain. He suffers pains towards the end of his life. He claims to have been talking with Mara, who is this, let's say, Buddha's demon that wants to keep us locked in samsara. Now, he's never tempted by Mara so much, but he does have Mara within his life. He talks about difficulties and controversies in the early Sangha, people disagreeing with him, even people trying to kill him. These are many stories that I think reveal something historical that might have been contained in a real life back then. So while these stories don't need to have been true in order for us to follow the path, they could all have been constructed, and still the path might be effective and worth undertaking. But nevertheless, having historically credible information about someone who followed this path, indeed somebody who originated the path, can provide us, I think, with a source of real inspiration and guidance in our own lives as we look forward. We might want to say, when looking at somebody like the Buddha, how did he do it? How did he get from point A to point B in this journey? What was he like? What was it like for him to do this? I think this can give us insights into our own journey. So one way to strive towards awakening, or to practice in the direction of awakening, is to consider what an awakened being might really be like. And if the Buddha wasn't an awakened being, it's hard to believe who would be. He's sort of the paradigmatic case. Or if we're, let's say, a Stoic, we might say Socrates is a paradigmatic case of an awakened being. So we look at these lives and ask, I think reasonably, what would they have really been like? And not just what the legends were about them. The legends were, perhaps constructed later and anyway are exaggerations in certain respects. We want to know what it was really like, or what it would have really been like. Now, as I say, we can find these stories in the early Buddhist texts, but they're buried in various places. The problem with the early Buddhist texts, indeed, the reason why the Abhidharma was later created out of them, is because they're voluminous. It's thousands and thousands of pages of material. It's scattered in various ways over multiple different dialogues and discussions and arguments and statements by the Buddha and statements by the Buddha's attendants and other monastics and other lay people. It's a huge amount of information for us to take on, so it's difficult for us to approach it through the early Buddhist texts alone. What we need is some kind of guidance. Unfortunately, there's really very little guidance to be had in respect of finding a historical account of the Buddha's life. There was a book written in the early 80s by H.W. Schumann. It was written in German and then translated into English. And that is at least one option, but the book can be somewhat difficult to find. I believe it's on Amazon, but it can be expensive sometimes. I don't know that it's even in print anymore. Other than that, there's really not very much. Years ago, one of the things I loved doing was watching the Great Courses. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Great Courses. It's a video series of lectures, of classes, of courses on various topics, and they have very, very few about Buddhism. And I once wrote them asking if they would do a course, something like this, on early Buddhism on the Buddha. Of course, they haven't done that. And most histories of the Buddha will be really histories of the later legends rather than of this early material. So we won't get a historical Buddha from most histories of the Buddha that you'll see out there for sale. So one option, which is, I think, very exciting, at least for me, and I hope for you, is that I've decided to make a history of the Buddha. And so this is going to be coming out as my new course over on the Online Dharma Institute. It's going to be called The Buddha's Life. It's a life of the Buddha from a historical perspective, using the material from the early texts, in particular the texts of the Pali Canon, selected texts of the Pali Canon, to illustrate that life, to illustrate its background, where it came from, not only in the Pali Canon, but in texts, in Brahminic texts, in the Upanishads, and other source material, but then coming forward into the life of the Buddha before he was awakened, what that was like, then what it was like just after his awakening. What was his awakening like, and how was his early teaching like? Because his teaching seems to have developed over time. And what were the early teachings like? What were the mature teachings like? What were some of the difficulties that he had along the way? And what happened during the end of his life, during the death of some of his closest companions, during his own death, and after his death? It's a long story, because there's a lot of material actually about the Buddha. Most of the material in the Pali Canon regards the Buddha's teachings, that is the Dharma, more than the Buddha himself as a figure. But I think there's an enormous amount to be had there anyway. So if that's of interest to you, I would check it out. I've got a link down below if you're interested in seeing what that's all about. I hope that this has been useful to you, and I hope I'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, all of you, be well.